Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? I can't tell. This is on. Yep. Oop. I better lower my voice. So thank you all. This is such a pleasure. That's not what's supposed to happen, is it? Let's try that again. There you go. So thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. First of all, I have to acknowledge how much of a pleasure it is to be in Puerto Rico. This island has gone through a difficult year, and when I heard about the hurricane, we had already talked about doing this presentation, and I started getting nervous. It's like, what's going to happen? Are things going to be all right? And things have been fabulous. So I just want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge how much of a pleasure it is for me to be at a UXPA event, and for me it's long overdue. I have been aware of the community since way before you all had an X in the name. And I saw the addition of the X as an exhortation for this community to start thinking more broadly about the remit of your work, right? And that is very fortuitous for me because that is what I'm hoping to do with this presentation. If you've seen my name at all, it is because I am the co-author of the 4th edition of the Polar Bear book on information architecture for O'Reilly with my friends Lou Rosenfeld and Peter Morville. And I've just published a book. It came out 2 weeks ago, a new book called Living in Information, Responsible Design for Digital Places. And my background is in architecture, although architecture is in the design of buildings, right, places. And, but as Sarah mentioned, I've been working in what we now call user experience design for close to 25 years at this point. I left my career in architecture a long time ago. And this book is about what people who do the sort of work that we do can learn from architecture so that we can create places that better support our needs. And there's a kind of interesting symmetry that I must acknowledge here. The last time I gave a presentation in Puerto Rico was a little over 20 years ago. And I spoke to a conference of architects about the wonderful things that architects could do with this brand new thing called the World Wide Web. And here I am, kind of closing the circle, talking to an audience of people who design digital experiences about the wonders of architecture. So I feel there's a good symmetry in that. So because my background is in architecture, I tend to look at the world through an architect's eyes. And my presentations often start by looking at a building. And this one is no exception. I didn't mention this, but I am based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Who here is from the Bay Area? You can raise your hands. Do you all know what this building is? Have you seen it? Yes? So this is a fairly important building in San Francisco. It's called 1 Montgomery Street. And this is a very interesting building for a variety of reasons. It was designed by an architect called Willis Polk, who's responsible for a lot of really great architecture in the city. But the reason, or one of the reasons why this building is really interesting, is that it was designed 110 years ago, or over 110 years ago, to be a bank. It was designed as a bank, and it's still serving its role as a bank. It now houses a branch of the Wells Fargo Bank. And California is, in the overall scheme of things, a relatively new place. And finding a building that is over 100 years old and is still serving its original purpose is really fascinating, especially because Wells Fargo has maintained it kind of in the state that it was when it was designed. And when you cross that front door, the portal, it's like you're walking through a time portal somehow. Like you're walking into this space where you get the feeling of what it was like to be in a bank 110 years ago. So it has these incredibly ornate ceilings and marble cladding everywhere, and it has this raised station for the bank's manager because they didn't have computers, so how else would they oversee what was going on with the tellers, right? It's a marvelous place. If you've seen the movie Mary Poppins, George Banks would feel right at home here, right? Among the interesting architectural details that this place has is it has these carved stone tables that bank patrons use to sign checks and write deposit slips and that sort of thing. And these tables have carved onto the top of them, onto their surface, inkwells. Because at the beginning of the 20th century, there were no ballpoint pens. People used fountain pens to do this kind of stuff, right? And the inkwells have been dry for a long time, because most of us don't use fountain pens anymore to do our day-to-day business. And increasingly, many of us don't do our bankings in places like this anymore. More and more of us are doing the sort of activities that we used to do in places like this, in places that look like this, right? So we are moving many of our key social activities from physical environments to environments made of information environments. And it's not just banking. We are increasingly moving and consuming our arts and entertainment to information environments. We are doing our shopping in information environments. You all may have heard of something called the Great Retail Apocalypse of 2017. And I know there are people from Amazon here in the audience, if you want to raise your hand. Right? We are increasingly learning in information environments. Some people are finding their mates in information environments. You know, I know people who have gotten married, who met online. This doesn't cease to surprise me, because this is something our species has been doing in physical space for a long time. Critically, we are holding important parts of our civic discourse in information environments. More on this a bit later. And of course, more and more of us are working in information environments. This photograph on the left is of a magnificent building. This is the great workroom in the Johnson Wax headquarters, which is a building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And this building was designed, I first must note, this is one of the very first open-plan office spaces in the world. So if you work in such an environment now and hate it, you know who to blame. But this building, this space was actually, it's a fairly famous physical environment. It was created, according to the architecture critic Paul Goldberger, to give the Johnson Wax Company's clerical workers a sense of community and nobility. I think that today, if we want to give our workers a sense of community, many of us carefully consider how we're going to structure our Slack channels. And unfortunately, many organizations have given up on the notion of giving us a sense of nobility. In any case, the main point here is that these information environments that we are responsible for are taking over from physical environments as the places where many key activities in our societies are taking place. Like physical environments, these things create contexts that influence the way we think and therefore the way that we act. The problem is that we have not been designing them as though they are contexts, as though they are places. If you listen to the language that we use when we talk about the work we do, and it's language I've heard over the last couple of days here, and which I have used myself, guilty as charged, we talk about designing products, or designing services, or designing interactions, or designing experiences. And these things are all ephemeral and transient and transactional. They are not settings. If you look at the tools that we think of when we think of digital design, they all lean towards the user interface, the surface layer, the screen. They don't lean towards context. One of the results of this is that these places are not serving us very well as contexts. We are living in a time of incredible polarization, regardless of where you sit in the political spectrum. And I think it's in great part due to the failings of our community to recognize that these things that we are making are places. I also see a lot of despair among my colleagues and peers about this situation, as though we don't know what to do. And my message, I hope, is a message of hope. I want to instill in you in the words of the great polymath Buckminster Fuller, to start encouraging all of you to start thinking like architects who are responsible for designing information environments that are shaping our social and cultural interactions. As for me, I have a question that I've been grappling with and which is at the center of the book and of this presentation, which is, how can we design information environments that better support our needs as a society in the long term? We are besieged by short-term thinking in this field. And architecture provides insights into how we can do that. So I bring you three big ideas, I hope, from the field of architecture that can hopefully help us do this, create environments that better support our needs in the long term. The first of these ideas is that all environments are supported, underlined by a conceptual structure. And what I mean by conceptual structure is we establish distinctions between parts of the environment. We set parts of the environment apart for different uses. In the best of cases, these differentiations help us recognize what different parts of the environment are for, while they maintain a coherent whole that gives us a sense that we are in a place that has coherency and that has purpose. These conceptual structures are what make environments understandable, they make it possible for us to use them and to figure out where we are and what we can do there. It influences how we think, not just about the environment, but about what we can do there and our role within it. So when I checked into the hotel on Tuesday night, I was given this piece of paper. Do you all have one of these? Yeah? So if you examine this piece of paper is a map to the distinctions that this environment has established upon this place. And there's graphics in it, and you can see that there are a series of overlaid floor plans for the hotel. There's a lake and a series of roads and stuff. And then there's a list, right, of the different places. And did you all read through this list? It's very curious. There's a bunch of pools here. One of the pools intrigued me. It says, adult pool, ages 18 or over. 18 and over, sorry. It's an important and or distinction. And that made me wonder, what does that mean? What does it mean about that pool, and what does it mean about the content of the other pools, especially, right? So I haven't been to the pool, by the way. Not because of that. But the point is, this is a series of distinctions that have been imposed on this environment by default. This very space that I'm standing on at one point looked like this. Okay? And this environment doesn't serve our needs very well if what we want to do is have a closing keynote at a conference, or a conference at all, right? So this architectural gesture that is hosting our experience together today is a design gesture, a very intentional one. And we do this all the time in architecture, and I think we do it when we're designing digital experiences as well. We label these parts of the physical environment so that we know how to move around and where things are, right? Like, I was completely disoriented on Tuesday. I took a red eye. That helped, right? But I was like looking around and trying to figure out where the conference was, and I saw this sign, and it's like, oh, well, you know, I don't really know what these labels mean at the moment, but I know that there is a labeling system to this environment that helps me figure out where things are. You know that you're crossing thresholds even when you are moving into parts of the environment that are quote-unquote undesigned, right? Like, the hotel is telling you something about the scope of their responsibility towards you, but with this sign. They're marking one part of the environment against the other. This is a distinction that they are establishing. Again, we do this sort of stuff all the time when we design digital experiences. And there's this exercise that I like to do on websites where I visit the website and cover the branding and try to see if I can get a sense of what that context is that this thing is creating merely through the labeling they use in their navigation systems. A lot of people in our field still think that information architecture is about creating navigation systems or sitemaps somehow. Yes, that's how these things are manifested, how they, how you experience them. But the key thing is, what are the distinctions that are created, and what do those distinctions do to your mindset when you visit this place? If you recognize the colors, this is Bank of America, but I don't think I need to tell you that this is a bank, right? Just the labels, banking, credit card loans, investments. Put your mind in a banking frame set, right? It tells you the stuff that you're going to do here is bank-like, and you bring certain expectations to that experience that have nothing to do with branding and a lot to do with the options that are laid out before you through the navigation bar. Now, why am I telling you about these conceptual structures in the context of designing information environments for the long term? It's because these things are the more long-lived parts of the experiences that we design. And this is something that I have known for a while kind of intuitively, but it only really came home to roost when I was working on the 4th edition of the Polar Bear book. Because one of my tasks in that project was updating all the examples. I had to revisit a lot of old websites, right? And the process of doing so, something became apparent, that our user interface technologies had evolved a lot in the 10 years that separate the 3rd edition and the 4th edition. In 2016, 2015, we had bigger displays, we had greater color gamuts, we had great typography, right? We had higher bandwidth, so we could do these enormous photographs. So the sites tended to look quite different. But when you looked at the navigation structures, you could clearly recognize them. You could see that they were kind of the same. And perhaps you have experienced this in your work as well. When you talk about doing a redesign, often you're talking about the surface stuff, not the structural stuff. The structural stuff usually manifests kind of deep distinctions that have to do with how that organization operates in the world. And you don't tinker with that stuff as frequently as you do with user interfaces. So the takeaway here is that these things that we design are composed of elements that change at different rates. They don't all change at the same speed. And websites and apps and digital experiences are not the only things that evolve like that in the world. Buildings too do it. Buildings change like that as well. Can I get a show of hands for how many people have seen this diagram before? All right, so it's worth covering it, not too many. This is a diagram, it's usually called a pace layer diagram. This is something that comes from the field of architecture, but it was originated by an architect called Frank Duffy, but it was popularized by Stuart Brand in a book he published in 1994 called How Buildings Learn, What Happens After They're Built. And this is a book about how buildings evolve, how buildings change over time, which is very much germane to our subject here today, right? And what this model says is that buildings don't all change at the same rate. They're composed of layers that change at different speeds. So they are, the slower changing layers are at the bottom, and they get increasingly faster as you go towards the top of the diagram here. So the slowest changing layer is what Brand calls the site. And you can think of that as the ground upon which the building sits, right? If you want to make an intervention on this space, changing the foundations, changing the site that this thing is sitting on is probably very expensive, time-consuming, and it would require a lot of effort, right? So it's not something that you want to do frequently. The next layer up is structure, and by that they mean the stuff that holds up the building, that keeps it from, keeps it resisting the force of gravity. You can see structure here. I hate these laser pointers, but I'm too far from the wall to show you. So you see these? These are probably structural elements, right? If you want to make an intervention in this space, cutting into those would be really expensive because you could have a potential collapse in your hands. So people don't do that, right? If they want to intervene, usually they will go one layer up to the layer they call skin. And skin is the sheathing of the building, right? You may have seen in some older cities these old buildings that have had huge holes cut into them to accommodate car garages, right? That usually those holes go through skin, they don't go through structure, right? So skin can change more quickly than other layers. Then you have services, which are things like plumbing and electricity and that sort of thing. Those change faster. Space plan, it's convenient that we're in this room because I can actually demonstrate one. Space plan are the internal divisions in spaces. You see this? This room can be divided into two rooms, right? By moving these panels fairly easily. So that's what they mean by space plan. And then the final layer, the one that changes the fastest, they call stuff. And by stuff, they mean all the furnishings and the stuff that you place inside of rooms. Once this presentation is over and we all head out to the deck to enjoy cocktails, there are cocktails, right? I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver here. The folks who work in the hotel will probably start disassembling this room by taking away the chairs and perhaps reconfiguring them. And you can change the space, the character of the space entirely just by moving around stuff, right? So that is the fastest changing layers. It's the easiest one to change. This is a super useful model. This applies to a lot of things in the world, and seeing it laid out in this hierarchy is very useful. And in a subsequent book, Brand expanded the model. How many people have seen this version? All right. So it's worth going into it as well, because not too many. So this is the base layer model that he published in a book called The Clock of the Long Now, which came out in 1999. And what he's doing here, he's saying, it's not just buildings that change like this. Civilizations change like this. That's like much, much broader, right? And the layers here also go from slowest at the bottom to fastest at the top. The slowest changing layer is what he calls nature, which that changes kind of at an evolutionary pace. Like the form of our bodies hasn't really changed that much, over time. Or it has changed, but it changes relatively slowly, at least compared to these other things. The next one up, he calls culture, then governance, infrastructure, commerce, increasingly getting faster and faster and faster. And finally, he has this layer he calls fashion or art. And you see it's a squiggly line, right? That's because that changes really fast. It changes all the time. Think of fashion, it's like you're wearing fashion, last year's fashion or whatever. You're unfashionable, and we're incentivized to keep it changing all the time. And it's an important point because he says, in this version of the model, he says, the civilizations that endure, the ones that stick around, manage a healthy combination of fast-moving with slow-changing. Because the fast-moving layers are where civilizations experiment with new ideas. That's the reason for the speed. You want to try new things, try new things, try new things. How long ago was it that people were playing Pokemon Go? And it seemed like everyone was playing Pokemon Go, right? Like that's like a trend. And that's an experimentation. It's like, wow, AR, it's happening, right? The ideas that are worthwhile, the ones that really kind of have teeth, become commercially successful. And they enter this layer of commerce which changes a little more slowly. Eventually, they start making it down the stack. And the ones that are really super useful and super successful end up becoming encoded in our cultures. And cultures change relatively slowly, right? So what he says here, which is a phrase, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's an idea that I love, is the fast layers are where civilizations learn, and the slow layers are where civilizations remember. That's a really great way of thinking about how to make things more resilient and long-lasting. It's a super useful model that has lots of applications, which is why I've cribbed it and used it for my own work. And I've mapped out the work that I do using a pace layer model. And I'll walk you through it really quickly. So, as with Brandt's models, the slower changing layers are at the bottom and the faster changing layers are at the top. So the slowest changing layer is what I call purpose, which is the reason why your organization or this thing that you're working on exists in the world. What is its purpose? What is it doing? What is it in service to changing, right? That purpose gets articulated, encoded as a strategy that differentiates the way that that thing exists in the world and competes in the market. That strategy, in turn, gets encoded into various governance models, right? How the organization operates, how it divides its teams up, how it relates to the market, how it sells its wares, how it deals with regulation, right? Like, that's all governance stuff. The fourth layer is where we come in. We are called to then start designing these digital experiences, and we must structure them by creating these conceptual distinctions that I was talking about at the beginning. And these structural distinctions, you won't be surprised to learn that I think that's where our information architecture sits here. These structural distinctions get articulated as forms. You can think of that as user interface, right? That is where people are touching screens and clicking on mice and stuff like that. I think that in our discipline, we've been thinking for a long time that these things are kind of at the same level and that they change kind of at the same level. They don't, right? As I pointed out earlier, there's evidence that the structural layer changes much more slowly than the user interface layer, because the advances in human-computer interaction are happening much faster than our organizations are changing, so the distinctions don't vary as much as the UI does. The other reason for separating it is that we are now functioning within a world where these structural distinctions can take on many, many forms. So you can experience an information environment on your mobile phone as an app or in a website. So Wells Fargo, which I showed earlier, has an app, has a website. They probably have IVR systems that you can call into. At some point, all these things are going to have voice agents that you're going to have to be interacting with, and which all need to have their foundations in a coherent structural layer. I'm not going to say consistent because it's not necessarily consistent, but at least you have to have coherency between these different things, right? The problem is that a lot of us who are in the design field gravitate towards form, because form is cool, form is shiny, form is the stuff that executives like to look at. They don't like to look at these abstract conceptual model diagrams, right? So we spend a lot of our time in that layer, kind of at the expense of the structural layer. So, structure. That is the first big idea. This is the second big idea. The notion that these structures and these forms and all these things that we are working on do not exist as independent entities in the world. They form part of and create systems. And we have not been doing our job of acknowledging and paying attention to the way that they create systems and enable systems. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Again, I'm going to use architecture as a model. So this room that we are inhabiting at the moment is not a simple rectangle of space. Okay? For this place to be inhabitable in the way that it is now, and have it be useful to us as conference goers, there are a lot of things that need to happen simultaneously. It's not just the physical stuff that is keeping the rain off our heads. We need to have an electrical grid that is making possible for you all to see this presentation and hear my voice. There is an air conditioning system that is keeping the temperature cool. There is a plumbing system that is allowing us to get up and use the restroom if necessary, right? There are telecommunication systems. There's a variety of different systems that are coming together in this space that we are inhabiting that make it possible for this to function as the environment that allows us to accomplish our goal of holding a conference. We do the same thing with information environments, but many folks do not see it or do not acknowledge it. And I'll give you an example. I think that one of the cleanest examples today is ride-sharing apps, right? And where's Carol? So we have at least one person from Uber, right? So that's what I'm talking about here, right? And when you think about Uber, you may be tempted to think that Uber is the thing that you install on your phone, right? And you know, somebody may say, I am working on the design of the Uber app. But I don't think, and I don't know, I don't have any insights into it. You may correct me if I misspeak, but I don't think that you can effectively design the Uber app, this thing that you as a passenger install on your phone, if you don't acknowledge that Uber and its competitors are marketplaces that match a demand with a supply. So that passenger app that you install on your phone has a driver app counterpart that is essential to its functioning. And you must understand how these two things, where these two things overlap and come together so that you can be effective at matching the supply and the demand. So it's a system. It's not a product, it's a system. And it's creating an environment, right? In order to successfully design any one of the parts, you at least need to be cognizant of the role that that part plays within the environment, within this broader system. And it's important for us to acknowledge that the boundaries of that system don't end cleanly with the organization. So these ride-sharing apps would be incredibly costly to create and build if the organizations that produce them also had to go out and map all of the streets of the world, right? So they are relying on services that are provided by a third party. And it's not just mapping. Think of the global positioning satellite system, right? That's something that Uber and its competitors did not put up in the sky, but it's essential to the functioning of this thing. As is the cell network. You know, these things rely on getting real-time information between the different actors in this environment. And of course, you do all these things through a smartphone that was built by Apple or Samsung or LG. So all of these things are part of this system, but they are not under the control of the company that is commissioning the thing that you're working on as a designer. And of course, the systems don't stop there either. The societies that these things function within are systems as well. And one of the things that we have to start vying for as designers is that the things that these systems that we are placing within this broader system don't compromise it. And ride-sharing apps such as Lyft and Uber have less so these days, I think. But in the past, they've gotten into in the news because the local guilds of like taxi drivers and stuff like that protest them, right? Because all of a sudden, like it's a major change into the economic ecosystem that they're launching into, and I'm happy to see that these organizations, these companies like Uber et al. Are acknowledging that. And I just want to read something that I saw on the job board, which was awesome because I think it exemplifies that. There's a job posting from Uber, and it starts with the following paragraph, which I'm going to read to you. It says, about us. This is how they're introducing themselves to you. We're changing the way people think about transportation. Not that long ago, we were just an app to request premium black cars in a few metropolitan areas. Now, We're part of a logistical fabric of more than 600 cities around the world, right? That's an acknowledgement of this evolution from thinking about it as a freestanding thing to, whoa, we are starting to become part of this ecosystem of this fabric, right? So that's the second big idea, this idea that we are really working within systems, and we have to understand how systems work. The third big idea is that systems are not static. They're continuously evolving. And one of the things that we need to do as designers is vie for their continuing viability as systems. So we need to ensure that they are somehow sustainable and resilient. This place was hit pretty hard 9 months ago. I don't know the extent of the damage to the hotel, but I heard someone told me on Tuesday evening that it was pretty bad, that this place was wrecked. By this place, I mean the place we're in now was wrecked. I mean, it's ocean facing, you can expect it. And I was surprised. The grounds are perfectly manicured. You know, last night I enjoyed a cocktail called a Rainforest Adventure. And it doesn't feel like a place that was hit by a major hurricane 9 months ago, right? So it's somehow it sprung back to life. So why did it spring back to life? Why is it in as good shape as it is now? I think that there's various factors at play, not least of which the fact that this is a pretty solid infrastructure we've got here, right? But there's also vested interests in keeping this place working, right? So somebody has put a lot of money into having this be in good enough shape to receive us here, right? So the viability of these environments rests in great part on the perceived value that they offer us as members of a society. So when I think about sustainability, I think about it in 3 spheres. And these spheres reflect the 3 pillars of sustainable development as they were defined in the 2005 World Summit of Sustainable Development. They are the economic pillar or economic sphere, the social pillar, and the ecological pillar. And they apply as much to businesses and physical environments as they do to the things that we work on, and I want to cover that now. So let's start with the economic pillar, which I think is the easiest to grok, because it's, I think, self-evident. The things that we make need to generate enough value to be what the business folks call a going concern, which means they can't lose money for very long, right? And I think that that sounds a little self-evident and perhaps facetious of me to say, but we have been operating within this construct where major civic discussions happen in information environments that have either unclear or perhaps even dubious business models. Twitter has been trying to sell itself, or at least was in the past, and could get no buyers. It's an interesting thing because this thing has taken on a pretty important role in our society, right? And it's unclear how they will generate the revenues necessary to keep it as a going concern, and that makes it vulnerable from a sustainability perspective, right? The second pillar is a social pillar, and you won't be surprised to learn that it's related to the first. These things that we are working on depend on a well-functioning society, right? And we need to vie to make sure that they don't compromise that society. And I think that we are running into trouble in great part because many of the most important ones that we are relying on have a business model that is based on the notion of selling your attention. You've heard this phrase, I'm sure, that if you are not paying for it, then you are the product, right? And that is the case here. And I don't want to sound like I'm coming down too hard on advertising. I think that advertising is more relevant for some types of information environments than for others. I think a lot depends on how well aligned our objectives as users, as people who use these things, how well aligned those objectives are with the objectives of the people who are paying for the environment, right? My personal take on this is that it's a hard go of having a civic discussion in an environment that is designed to literally persuade you so you can consume more by dividing you and I into ever smaller demographic segments. It seems to me that that is the exact opposite of what you want to do if you want to have a well-functioning civic conversation. You want to figure out ways of getting people to work together and be on the same footing. So I think that we need to move beyond this for some of these important information environments. That's the social pillar. The third pillar, the ecological pillar, is perhaps a bit more nuanced and requires a little bit more explanation. And you may be wondering, what does ecology have to do with all this stuff that you're talking about? Isn't ecology about the whales and saving the planets and the rainforest and all this stuff? Yes, it is that. And if you think about what ecology is, it's talking about a system, right? An ecosystem. And our environments, our physical environments, their ecological purpose is to somehow support life, if you think about it that way. And when we talk about a physical environment that has become polluted, you talk about an environment that is no longer capable of supporting life somehow. And information environments, they don't necessarily support life, but they support the transmission of meaning. That is what they do. And when we talk about information environments becoming polluted, we mean that their ability to convey meaning successfully has become compromised. There is a media theorist who worked mostly in the 70s and 80s called Neil Postman, and he has a great model to think about this. He called it the semantic environment. And I'm not going to go into it now, but suffice it to say that he said that for meaning to be conveyed successfully in an environment, all participants in the environment need to be clear on the meaning of the vocabulary they're using, the social norms, and the hierarchical distinctions that the different actors in the environment have. And one of the things that we are kind of at risk of doing here, he also said, one of the ways that information environments, he called them semantic environments, become polluted is when we start using the terminology of one context in another context and changing the meaning of words. And we're starting to see that happen. So we have this term, this word in the English language, which I think is a key word for well-functioning societies, especially in liberal democracies. The word is news. News is the feedback mechanism for the system that is our society. And we have been much too cavalier with our approach to this feedback mechanism. And we talk about the news feed. It's a Facebook screenshot. I don't want to sound as though I'm coming too hard on Facebook. I know there are Facebookers here, right? I love you all. I love Facebook. But I think that we need to move beyond some of these things, okay? This idea that the news used to be something where you got information about the state of the world is now being replaced with this notion that we all have this personalized news feed that is creating a small picture of the world that is only showing you what will engage you so as to keep you providing more dollars coming from advertisers. And that, my friends, is a recipe for disaster. And I think that we are starting to see it play out. And I think it's in great part why we are in this situation where political discourse has become essentially impossible. We are living in different worlds, quite literally. So to recap, these are the three pillars: the economic, social, and ecologic pillar. Now, when we talk about sustainability in the physical environment, we think of critical, non-renewable resources, right? Like the things that we can't make more of, that are key to life. And we talk about the air and about water, right? And these things, like, we know we have to preserve them, we have to protect them. And I think that in information environments, we also have a key non-renewable resource, and we have to become fierce advocates for its good use. That is the attention of the human beings who use the things that we make. I think that all of us need to ask ourselves, what are we doing with this resource? How are we using it? Are we using it to help our fellows become better citizens, better parents, better coworkers? Or are we using them to generate dopamine hits so that people keep clicking on ads? I think it's a fundamental misuse of this resource. I'm nearing the end, I promise. I'm starting to rant, which is good. I bet the rainforest adventure is starting to sound pretty good about now, right? Like, this is heavy stuff, man. So, Alan Cooper has been exhorting the design profession to start thinking about what we can do to be better ancestors. I love that, right? That speaks to the long term. That's what I'm really passionate about. And my answer, at least from my little corner of the UX profession, is I aim for trying to ensure the long-term viability of the contexts where we are increasingly living our lives, and more importantly, the societies that they enable. Now, one thing that I must admit to is when I've been working on this and writing about it and talking about it, my audience is primarily designers. And because I had never been to a UXPA event, I didn't know what to expect. I thought, it's like, these folks are kind of my nerds, right? Like, this is part of my crowd. And then I got here, it's like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of researchers here. It's like, I wasn't expecting that. And I even asked them, it's like, do you think of yourself as a designer? I had people say, no, I'm a researcher. It's like, well, so I've been thinking, over the past couple of days, like, what can I tell folks who are more on the research side? What can you do? Like, are they going to get back to work on Monday and think, man, this stuff that I'm doing, what can I do to help change this? And I wanted to encourage you and say, perhaps you don't think of yourself as a designer if you're a researcher, but as a researcher, you have this incredible superpower in that you are oftentimes the people who are defining the framing questions that are going to lead to the insights that then lead to design. You're like way down the stack, right? And this is something that Dan Hill, a designer and author, calls the architecting of the problem. Architecting the problem has incredible power. So my invitation to you is, when you go back to work on Monday, hopefully recovered from all the fun you've had here, you think about framing the problems, the research problems that you're undertaking in terms of these three things. So, for example, what are the conceptual distinctions that we currently impose upon the world with our environment? That's an interesting research question, I think. What systems are we participating in and creating? Where are the boundaries of those systems? What agency does this organization have? What agency do our users have on these systems? And finally, and perhaps kind of more ambitiously, how can we make these systems more sustainable? Where is the money coming from? What are these things doing to our social fabric? What are they doing to our language, to the ecology of the ecology of meaning, really? As we move more and more of our activities into information environments, those of us involved in the design of these things have more agency and responsibility than ever before. through our work, we can bring wholeness and healing to societies that frankly are desperately needing it. We can and must choose to do so. Thank you. I think we're going to take a couple of questions. If nobody's tired of hearing me talk and not desperate for a rainforest adventure. It's not that good. Don't think that I'm advocating. No? No questions? I can't see. There's a slide.
Hello, and thank you so much for speaking. I was so excited to see that you were the speaker here because I love information architecture, but I have a really hard time explaining it.
Yes.
It's the worst, right? Try talking about research to business stakeholders and then never mind, oh, we need to complete an information architecture study or reassess it. I mean, it's vapor to them. So what methods have you used to help your business stakeholders or anyone else kind of buy in, someone who's completely outside of our profession?
You know, it's a bit of a tricky question for me to answer because of the position that I'm in. A lot of folks search me out for information architecture, so they already kind of come primed for it. One thing that is important for, I think, everyone to be aware of is that, this is going to come across as being cheeky as something said by an information architect, is that we need to stop obsessing so much about labels, right? The important thing is that the work be done, and if the label information architect confuses people, then don't use it. Talk about, you know, we need to figure out what the navigation is. Do you all know the term MacGuffin? Yep. Does this word ring a bell? So MacGuffin is, it's one of my favorite words. It's a word that was coined by Alfred Hitchcock. It comes from the world of cinema. And the MacGuffin is an artifact in a movie plot that the whole plot revolves around, but which is ultimately kind of inconsequential to the plot. It just precipitates all the action that ensues, right? So if you think of the Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's a MacGuffin. Like, everyone spends the whole movie chasing after the Ark, and then at the end they conveniently cart it into this government warehouse, right? Because you don't want something as powerful as the Ark out in the world, right? And because it doesn't really matter. I mean, it was just an excuse to have this interesting adventure movie, right? And oftentimes I find that the conversation needs to be framed in terms that the people who you're going to be engaging with understand and care about. And that requires that we look for MacGuffins. Oftentimes the people say, we need to redesign our navigation. To me, that's a MacGuffin. It's like, no, you need to rethink your information architecture. But I'm not going to tell you that because your eyes are going to glaze over, and then I'm going to have a harder time. It's like, sure, let's work on your information architecture, and then you do all this conceptual modeling and thinking through language and all that stuff. I don't know if that helps. Yeah. Someone else?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. It's great to see someone finally thinking about this, you know, kind of the implications of a lot of this stuff. I was just wondering if you had any insight into how this happened, because sometimes if you're really going to change things, you kind of have to figure out, well, how did we get here?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie and say that I have original opinions on this, but the writer, so you know Jaron Lanier? He's an early VR pioneer. He has written, I think it's 3 books at this point about this stuff. There is also a great book by Tim Wu called The Attention Merchants that recaps the story of advertising, how it came about, and what it means for the future. So that's one I would definitely recommend looking into. I can't see.
So I have thank you for your talk. So when I entered this field, I was thinking about the building architect as the role model of what we are doing. Now there's a big difference between what user experience or the power of user experience today and the power of an architect. So user experience is still fighting for its role in the development process, and the building architect is the lead when erecting a building. So he's driving this project and making the key decisions. So I see a big difference between the power of user experience today and the power of an architect. So my question to you is, any ideas how to close that gap?
Yes. I'm going to actually flip back to my... That's not what I wanted. Yeah, we need to move down this stack. That's the answer to that. Architects did this a long time ago, right? Like they figured that out. Like you need to architect the problem. We have been, as a discipline, we have been much too meek about recognizing the power that we have and the impact that our work has. And we have kind of viewed ourselves as people whose role it is to make things easier to find, easier to understand, more usable, right? So, and that doesn't really even, that implies that you're not even questioning the premise of the thing you're making, right? Whereas architects, you know, we as designers expect that we are going to be given requirements somehow. Architects define requirements. Like when you're going to build something, I can bet you, and I don't know anything about how this building that we're in was designed, but I can bet you that whoever commissioned this building did not have very tight specifications as to what this building should be like. Part of what architects do is they help figure out how to frame the problem properly and what the solution is going to be. And they've been doing this for a long time. You know, there's a whole series of conceptual tools that architects use, you know, the partie, the programming phase, right? Things that we have not been doing as part of our work. And actually, there's a role called product manager that has emerged to kind of meet the need that we failed to serve, right? So we have this kind of dual role with the product manager that kind of does what the architects do. That's my sense anyways. Is that it? One more, and then Rainforest Adventures. Right. Notice I said it in the plural that time. No? No other? The Rainforest Adventure sounded too good? All right, thank you so much.